The moment Augusta Hart stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, she already knew that everything she had been promised was a lie. The town that had been described to her in letters as a thriving frontier community with a fine church and respectable boarding houses turned out to be a cluster of sun-bleached wooden buildings leaning against one another like tired old men, a main street of packed earth that had turned to soup in the recent rains, and a saloon so loud you could hear it from the edge of town. Augusta stood with her single leather trunk beside her feet, her brown traveling dress dusty from 3 days on the road, her dark hair pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and she took a long, measured breath of dry Texas air while she assessed the situation with the calm practicality that had carried her through every misfortune of her 24 years. She had come here because there had been nothing left for her in Missouri. Her father had died owing money to half the county. The farm had been sold before he was cold in the ground. Her Aunt Clara had taken her in for one winter, and Augusta had been grateful truly. But Clara had 5 children of her own and a husband who looked at Augusta with too much interest and too little shame. When the notice had appeared in the St. Louis Gazette seeking a schoolteacher for the settlement of Redemption Creek, Texas, Augusta had written her letter of application before she had even set the paper down. The superintendent of the newly formed school board, a Mr. Elias Drummond, had written back promptly, enthusiastically, and with a great many exclamation points. There would be a schoolroom, he said. There would be a proper teacher's cottage, he said. There would be 32 pupils eager to learn, he said. Augusta had read his letters 3 times apiece, looking for reasons not to trust them, and had found none, which in retrospect she understood to have been the problem. She had been too hopeful. Hope, in her experience, had always been the first step toward disappointment. The schoolroom was a single room attached to the back of the church, which itself was missing several boards from its south wall. The teacher's cottage was a one-room cabin behind the church with a stove that listed to one side, and a roof that had the look of something that had lost an argument with the wind. The 32 pupils, she would discover, ranged in age from 6 to 16, with temperaments ranging from shy to feral. Still, she reminded herself it was hers. She had a position, a wage of $22 a month and 4 walls to call her own. That was more than she had left behind. She was dragging her trunk toward the church when she heard the sound of hooves and turned to see a man riding down the main street at an easy lope, the kind of rider who looked as though the horse had been built specifically to carry him. He was tall in the saddle, lean and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn brown duster and a hat that had seen considerable weather. He had dark hair that curled a little at the collar and a jaw that carried several days of stubble. He might have been anywhere from 26 to 30. Augusta noted all of this with the detached efficiency of a woman who had learned to take stock of strangers quickly and trust them slowly. He pulled the horse up when he saw her struggling with the trunk, swung down from the saddle in a single fluid motion, and landed in the mud of the street without apparent concern. "You need a hand with that?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular flatness of a man who chose his words and did not waste them. "I am managing fine, thank you," Augusta said, which was not entirely true, as the trunk had lodged itself against a root and was not moving. He looked at the trunk, looked at her, and seemed to decide something. "Mind if I try?" She stepped back and gestured at the trunk with one hand. He crouched, gripped it by the leather handles, and lifted it out of the mud as though it contained nothing heavier than a collection of feathers. He straightened and looked at her with dark eyes that were measuring without being intrusive. "Where to?" he asked. "The teacher's cottage, behind the church," she pointed. He walked ahead of her with the trunk, and she followed, not because she needed an escort but because the trunk was going in that direction. He set it down on the small covered porch of the cabin and turned back to her, settling his hat with one hand. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said. It was not a question. "I am, Augusta Hart." She extended her hand in the businesslike fashion she had decided upon, not the delicate fingertip offering that some women practiced, but a full, firm handshake. He took it, and his hand was rough with work and warm. "Thomas Monroe. I run the livery stable on the east end of town." "The liveryman," she said. "Among other things," he said. She was not sure what the other things were, and she almost asked. But he had already touched the brim of his hat and turned away, collecting his horse's reins from where he had looped them over the fence post, swinging back up into the saddle with that same easy economy of motion. He rode away without looking back, and Augusta stood on the porch of her leaning little cabin and watched him go, and told herself firmly that she had not come to Texas to be distracted by broad-shouldered liverymen with unhurried voices. She had come to teach. The first morning of school was a study in controlled chaos. Augusta arrived early, swept the schoolroom floor, arranged the benches in rows, and wrote her name on the small chalkboard at the front of the room with large, clear letters. Miss Hart. She placed her hand-drawn map of the United States on the wall, her small collection of McGuffey readers on the corner table, and her arithmetic primer on the desk. The children arrived in waves. The younger ones came first, wide-eyed and tentative, clutching slates, and looking at her the way small animals look at something they cannot yet classify as safe or dangerous. The older ones came later, the boys especially, slouching in the doorway and looking at her with expressions that were a masterclass in studied indifference. There was a boy named Danny Prout, 14 years old and big for his age, who sat in the back row and made a show of falling asleep before Augusta had finished calling the register. There were the Chavez sisters, Maria and Lucia, 9 and 11, who were quiet and attentive and smiled at her shyly when she spoke to them in the careful Spanish she had taught herself from a grammar book. There was a small boy named Henry who cried for 20 minutes over his lost slate pencil, until Augusta produced a spare from her desk and pressed it into his hand, at which point he stopped crying and looked up at her with such relief and gratitude that she felt the particular sharp warmth of remembering why she had chosen this work. She had been teaching for perhaps an hour and a half when the door of the schoolroom opened and Thomas Monroe stepped in. He took off his hat immediately, held it in both hands, and waited near the door until she glanced at him. She held up one finger to indicate she was in the middle of something, finished explaining the long division problem on the board, and then walked to the door. "Mr. Monroe," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so as not to interrupt the children's work. "Miss Hart, sorry to interrupt." He looked genuinely sorry. "I have a boy here that should be in your school, my nephew. He just arrived from San Antonio day before yesterday." He stepped aside, and Augusta saw, standing a little behind him, a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 with Thomas's same dark hair and serious eyes, wearing clothes that were too big and holding a hat in both hands the same way his uncle held his. "His name is Caleb," Thomas said. "His mother, my sister Ruth, she passed in February. There's no other family. He'll be staying with me now." Augusta looked at the boy, and he looked back at her with the particular solemnity of a child who has had to become more careful than children should have to be. "Hello, Caleb," she said at the same level as him, bending slightly at the knee. "I am Miss Hart. We are doing arithmetic this morning. Do you like numbers?" Caleb considered this seriously. "They are all right," he said. "A diplomatic answer," she said. "Come in." She straightened and glanced at Thomas, who was looking at the boy with an expression that was part tenderness and part worry, the look of a man who had not expected to find himself responsible for a child and was doing his best to rise to it without letting the boy see the uncertainty underneath. "Thank you," he said to her quietly. "He will be fine," she said, and meant it. Over the following weeks, Augusta found a rhythm in Redemption Creek. She taught from 7 until 2, then spent the afternoons preparing lessons, collecting late fees from the school board, which arrived with elaborate apologies from Mr. Drummond and no actual money, and gradually making the cabin livable. She hung curtains she sewed herself from flour sacks. She fixed the stove with a rock and a length of wire. She planted a small kitchen garden at the south side of the cabin in the rich dark soil, and felt the quiet, private satisfaction of someone making a life from what was available. She saw Thomas Monroe regularly. Redemption Creek was not a large town, and the livery was on her path between the cabin and the church, and Caleb was in her school every day, which meant that Thomas came by each afternoon to collect him. He was never intrusive. He did not linger. He came, waited on the porch, tipped his hat to her when she came to the door, and walked back down the street with the boy beside him, and she watched them go from the doorway and then went back inside to her marking. But one afternoon, a rider came in too fast and too hard on a horse that was stumbling with exhaustion, and when Augusta stepped out of the schoolroom to see what the commotion was, she saw that it was Thomas who reached the horse first, catching the reins and speaking to the animal in a low, steady voice, while the rider, a young cowhand barely older than her oldest pupils, practically fell from the saddle. "Water," Thomas said to someone behind him, not raising his voice, just certain that the request would be fulfilled. And it was, because people did what Thomas Monroe said in a calm voice in the way they do not always respond to shouting. He held the horse steady, ran his hands along its legs, checked its breathing, and then handed the animal off to his stable hand with quiet instructions, while someone else helped the shaking cowhand to a bench outside the general store. Augusta found she had been watching the whole thing. She went back inside and stared at her lesson plan for arithmetic and thought about the way he had spoken to the horse, that particular tone of complete reliability, and she pressed her lips together and wrote down the number 8 3 times for no reason, and then crossed it out. Spring deepened into summer, and the Texas heat arrived with a commitment that Augusta respected even while it made her schoolroom nearly unbearable. She taught with the door and windows open, and the children wilted on their benches, and she brought a pail of water and a tin cup and made sure every one of them drank enough. She told them stories in the afternoon heat, when the arithmetic refused to stick in their heat-loosened minds, stories she made up about explorers and mathematicians and painters, stories with enough adventure to keep even Danny Pruitt's eyes open and fixed on her. It was after one of these late summer afternoons, when the children had gone home and the light was going amber and low, that Thomas appeared in the doorway not to collect Caleb, who had gone ahead with the stable hand, but alone. He knocked on the open door frame. "Miss Hart, do you have a moment?" She was erasing the board. She turned. "Of course." He came in and stood with his hat in his hands again. She had noticed he always took his hat off inside, even a schoolroom, even a barn once when she had passed by and seen him through the open door. There was a deliberateness about him that she found herself thinking about more than was strictly warranted. "I wanted to ask," he said, "if you might come to supper on Friday. Caleb has been working on something he wants to show you. He won't tell me what it is. I think it's a story he wrote." A pause. "It would just be the 3 of us. I can cook a reasonable meal. Nothing fancy." She looked at him and he looked at her, and there was nothing improper in the invitation and nothing hidden in it that she could see, just a man asking a thing plainly. "I would be glad to," she said. She arrived at Thomas's place on Friday evening with a jar of the blackberry preserves she had made from the bushes along the creek, because arriving empty-handed was not something Augusta Hart did. The house was not large, a 2-room structure with a covered porch, but it was clean and solid, and someone had driven a row of fence posts around a kitchen garden that was clearly new and enthusiastic and somewhat chaotic, as though the garden had been planted with more hope than planning. Caleb met her at the porch with the solemnity he seemed to carry everywhere. He was holding a sheaf of papers that had been tied together with a piece of twine. "I wrote it myself," he said, before she had even said hello. "It's about a boy who discovers a wild horse and they become friends." "That sounds like exactly the kind of story I want to read," Augusta said, and she meant it because she did. They sat on the porch while the supper finished cooking, and Caleb read to her in his careful, serious voice, stumbling a little on the longer words but pressing on with the determination of someone who has decided that stumbling is acceptable as long as stopping is not. The story was, in fact, quite good. The boy in it had a loneliness that Caleb had not written directly, but that lived in the spaces between the sentences, and the horse was drawn with such love and detail that Augusta felt the particular tightness in her chest that comes from recognizing something true. Thomas came out and leaned against the porch post and listened. He did not interrupt or offer commentary. He just listened, and Augusta caught herself watching his face more than she watched the boy reading, watching the way the severity around his eyes softened when he looked at Caleb, the way his mouth curved up at the good parts barely, but there. After supper, which was venison stew and cornbread, and not fancy at all but warm and good, Caleb fell asleep in the chair by the fire with his story papers on his chest. Thomas carried him to bed without waking him, and Augusta washed the supper dishes at the basin, because that was what you did when someone cooked for you, and she was good at finding the shape of an evening and fitting into it naturally. Thomas came back and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room. "You don't have to do that." "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he came to stand beside her and picked up the drying cloth and dried the bowl she had just washed. They stood side by side and worked in a silence that was not awkward but the other kind of silence, the kind that settles between people who are beginning to understand they are comfortable in the same space. "He is going to be all right," Augusta said. "Caleb, he is grieving, but he is doing it the way children do, which is quietly and through the things they make. The story is very good." "I don't know how to do this properly," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that was raw and honest in a way she had not heard from him before. "He is my sister's boy and I loved Ruth, but I don't know how to raise a child. I don't know what I'm doing." Augusta set down the pan she had been washing and looked at him. "Nobody knows what they are doing," she said. "Every person raising a child is improvising. The fact that you brought him here, that you enrolled him in school, that you listened to him read his stories without making him feel watched or judged, those are the things that matter. He knows he is safe with you. That is not a small thing." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. The firelight from the main room was the only illumination in the kitchen, and it was warm and unsteady. "How do you know that?" "Because I was a child who wasn't safe," she said simply, "and I know the difference in the way children carry themselves." Caleb is held up from the inside. The silence between them was different then. It was the silence of two people who have each shown a seam of something real and are waiting to see how the other person treats it. "I appreciate that," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct. "More than I know how to say properly." She turned back to the dishes. "You are already saying it properly," she said. She walked home under the wide Texas sky with the jar of preserves she had forgotten to leave on the table and the feeling, the unsettling, bright, alarming feeling, that something had begun that she had not planned for and would not now be able to unbegin. The trouble came, as trouble does in small frontier towns, unexpectedly and from a direction nobody had been watching. In August of that year, a man named Garrett Coles arrived in Redemption Creek. He came by way of San Antonio, with money in his pocket and a surveyor's certification he showed freely, and he had the manner of a man who had learned to present himself as reasonable while carrying intentions that were anything but. Coles had been retained, he said, by the Atchison and Pacific Railroad Company to survey a potential route through the valley. The valley in question, the one through which Redemption Creek sat, was the most direct path between the company's current eastern terminus and the silver country to the west. The railroad, Coles explained over drinks at the saloon, would be a great benefit to the town. Progress, commerce, the future arriving on iron rails. What he did not say directly, but which became clear over the following days, was that the railroad route as he had mapped it required the relocation of a significant portion of the town's south end, including the schoolhouse and church, the half-dozen homesteads east of the creek, and the stretch of valley land occupied by the small community of Mexican families, the Riveras and the Blancos and the Garcias, who had been farming that land for more than 20 years. Since before Redemption Creek had been anything other than a place where cattle drank. Augusta heard about it from Maria Chavez, who came to school that Monday with red eyes and a frightened look, and who told Augusta in a mix of English and Spanish that her father had received a man the previous evening who had told him that his land was going to be needed, and that he would be paid a fair price, and that the word fair had been said in a tone that meant anything but. Augusta sat very still while Maria talked, her hands folded on the desk, and she let the information settle before she spoke. "Your father owns his land," she said to Maria. "He has papers." "Yes," Maria said, "but the man from the railroad said papers don't always hold up." "They hold up fine," Augusta said, with more certainty than she strictly felt. "I am going to look into this." She went to see Thomas that afternoon. She found him in the livery, working on a saddle with a leather punch and a patience that was apparently infinite. He set the work down when she came in and stood up. She told him everything Maria had told her. He listened without interrupting. His face went through something while she talked, a settling, a hardening, not anger exactly, but the thing that precedes it in a man who keeps himself controlled. "I've heard about Coles," he said. "I don't trust him." "Neither do I, but it is more than trust. The families along the South Creek have been there for 20 years, some of them longer. They have deeds, they have legal standing. Coles is counting on them not knowing that," Thomas said, "which is why they need to know it." She met his eyes. "I can write letters. I can draft the kind of letter that makes it clear these families know their rights and are prepared to defend them through the proper legal channels. I have read enough law to understand the basics of land title. My father had to fight a similar thing in Missouri, though he lost, partly because he didn't have anyone to write the letters properly." Thomas looked at her steadily. "That's not going to make Coles happy." "I am not in the business of making men like Coles happy," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "No, I don't imagine you are." They spent that evening, and several evenings after, at Thomas's kitchen table, Augusta writing letters by lamplight while Thomas went back and forth between the table and the stove, keeping coffee in her cup, reading what she wrote, asking questions, and occasionally adding something of his own in the plain, direct language of a man who might not have had much formal education, but had the kind of clear thinking that mattered more. The letters went to the county land office in Galveston, to the Texas state legislature, to a lawyer in San Antonio named Morales whom Thomas knew from a previous dealing, and who, crucially, was sharp and honest and took cases on principle as well as payment. They went to the Galveston Daily News, because Augusta believed in sunlight as the best disinfectant, and she wrote that letter with a precision and clarity that she was privately rather proud of. While they waited for responses, Coles made his moves. He had a way of catching the South Creek families separately, when they were in town alone, when their English was under pressure, and presenting them with documents to sign that were framed as agreements of cooperation. 3 families signed before Augusta got word of it, and she felt a cold fury about that, the particular fury of watching something preventable happen just barely past the moment when it could have been prevented. She went to each of those families. She sat in their houses and drank the coffee they offered and listened to what had been promised to them, and she read the documents they had signed, and she told them clearly and without panic what she saw in the language. 2 of the documents had release clauses that, while troubling, were not final. One had language vague enough to be challenged. None of them were, she was almost certain, enforceable against a proper legal challenge, particularly once Morales came north from San Antonio. Coles found out she was doing this. She was not surprised. He came to the school one afternoon when the children had left, and he stood in the doorway in his expensive coat and his surveyor's hat, and he looked at her with the particular brand of condescension men like him, reserved for women who declined to understand their place. "Miss Hart," he said pleasantly, "I wonder if I might have a word." "You may have several," she said. She did not stand up from her desk. He told her, still pleasantly, that she was interfering in a legal business matter and that the railroad was a benefit to this community, and that her efforts to cause trouble for the process would be noticed by the school board, who, he reminded her, controlled her employment. Augusta looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Coles," she said, "the school board is composed of 6 men, 4 of whom have homesteads in this valley and 2 of whom have neighbors who farm the South Creek land. I do not think your leverage with them is as firm as you believe. And I would like you to notice that I have not asked you to leave my school, because unlike you I was raised to be polite, but I am asking you now." He left, and she waited until he was gone before she let her hands shake, which they did briefly, and then stopped because she told them to. That evening Thomas came by the cabin. He had heard about Coles's visit from at least 3 people, because in Redemption Creek almost nothing happened without being witnessed and reported. "Are you all right?" he asked from the porch. The evening was warm, and the sky was a particular shade of dark blue that had only turned in Texas just before the stars came out fully. "I am completely all right," she said, and opened the door wider. "Come in." He came in and she poured him coffee because she still had the pot on, and they sat across from each other at the small table. He had a look on his face that was part concern and part something else, something that sat along the lines of admiration and was trying to be careful about saying so. "You told him to leave your school," Thomas said. "I did." "Good." He turned his coffee cup in both hands. Morales wrote back. "He is coming up from San Antonio next week. He has reviewed the copies of the documents you sent, and he believes there are strong grounds for challenge." Augusta felt the particular lightness that comes from a problem moving in the right direction. "That is excellent news." "It is." He looked at her. "What you have been doing for these families, writing those letters, going to their houses, reading those documents, they trust you. I hope they do. I have tried to earn it." "You have," he said, and the simplicity of it landed differently than compliments usually did with her, which were generally elaborate and often wanted something in return. This wanted nothing. It was just true, offered plainly. She looked at him across the small table and the lamp between them, and she was aware, in a way that was no longer deniable, that she had fallen into considerable feeling for this man. It had not happened in a single moment, but in the accumulation of moments, the evenings at the kitchen table and the mornings he stopped to say hello, and the way he looked at his nephew and the steadiness of him, the way he occupied space without consuming it, the way he listened. She was also aware, because she was honest with herself, that she was frightened of it. She had not come here for this. She had come here to build something of her own, something that did not depend on anyone else, something that could not be taken from her by someone else's choices or failures. Feeling this way about someone was a kind of vulnerability she had not budgeted for. She looked down at her coffee cup. "I should let you get home to Caleb." He paused before standing, as though he was going to say something and decided against it. He put on his hat at the door and said, "Thank you for the coffee," and left. She sat for a long time after he was gone, listening to the sounds of the Texas night outside her window. Morales arrived the following Tuesday on the midday stage, a compact, precise man in his 40s with an immaculate suit, and the kind of reputation that preceded him like a second person entering the room. He met with the South Creek families for 2 full days, reviewed every document, and then met with Coles in the saloon, because Morales had the particular skill of choosing the location of a confrontation so that it happened where he wanted it. Augusta was not in the saloon, because the saloon was not a place for the schoolteacher, but she had Thomas's report of it by evening. Morales had laid out, quietly and with specific reference to Texas land statutes and the relevant case law, the manner in which Coles's survey and his acquisition attempts were legally deficient. He had 3 of the family signatures invalidated on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. He had letters of support from 2 state legislators whose districts included land that might be similarly affected by the railroad's route proposals. Coles left Redemption Creek on the Thursday stage. The families of the South Creek had a celebration that Saturday, a gathering at the Rivera house that included more food than Augusta had seen assembled in one place since Missouri, and music from 3 fiddles and a guitar, and the kind of dancing that went well past sunset and was watched from the fence line by half the town. Thomas danced, which she would not have predicted, not with any particular elegance but with an honest willingness and a good sense of rhythm. He danced with Maria Chavez's grandmother and with little Lucia and with Augusta herself, twice, which was noticed by everyone who was watching and commented upon by several, and Augusta did not care. She cared very much, in fact, but about the dancing, not the commentary. He held her correctly, one hand at her waist, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her dress, and they moved to a reel that was fast enough that conversation was impractical, and she was glad of it because she did not know what she would have said, and she did not want to say the wrong thing. He looked at her once in the middle of it, and she looked back, and then they both had to attend to the steps. September came, and with it cooler air and the particular gold of Texas autumn. The school had grown. Word had spread to some of the outlying homesteads, and 3 new children had arrived, including a girl named Pearl who was 16 and had never been taught to read, and who sat in the back of the room with her chin up and her eyes fierce, daring anyone to make something of her situation. And Augusta did not, just placed a primer in front of her and started from the beginning without ceremony. Pearl was reading simple sentences by October, and Augusta saw her practicing in the churchyard one afternoon when she thought no one was watching, her lips moving over the words on the page, and Augusta felt the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of her work in a way that pushed everything else out for a moment. But it was October that brought the thing Augusta had not seen coming. A letter arrived from Missouri, forwarded through 3 addresses and arrived battered and delayed, from her Aunt Clara. The letter said that a man named Willard Fitch, who had held a portion of her father's debt, had apparently found Augusta's position in Redemption Creek through some inquiry, and was coming to collect what he claimed was owed to him. Fitch, the letter said, was not reasonable. He had been to the farm twice already and frightened Clara's children with his manner. He was coming to Texas. Augusta sat with this letter for a long time. The debt he claimed was her father's, not hers, and she had never signed for any of it and had not even been of legal age when most of it was incurred. She did not owe Willard Fitch anything. She knew this. She also knew that knowing it and it being uncontested were 2 different things, and she had already seen this spring what happened when a man with a bad claim showed up in a place where people were uncertain of their rights. She did not want to tell Thomas. This was irrational, and she knew it, because Thomas was exactly the kind of person you wanted beside you in a difficulty. But there was something in her that resisted needing him in the specific way this would require. She had a vision of herself that included managing her own problems, and to have this particular one, this remnant of her father's failures, arrive on the heels of everything she was trying to build, felt diminishing in a way she could not quite articulate. She told him anyway, because not telling him would have required her to be smaller than she was. She told him on the porch of his house after she had brought Caleb home from school, in the blunt and organized way she had learned to deliver difficult information, without decoration, but also without false lightness. She told him about her father's debts, about Willard Fitch, about the letter from Clara. She told him that she believed Fitch's claim was legally unfounded, but that his arrival would be disruptive and potentially hostile, and that she was telling Thomas because he ought to know what might be coming to his town. Thomas listened. He sat on the porch step with his hands loosely clasped between his knees and his hat on the rail beside him, and he listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything in the debt that actually has your name on it?" he asked. "Nothing. I was 17 when the first of it was signed, and my father did not involve me in his finances." "Then Fitch has no standing." He said it the same way she had said it to herself, simply and directly. "No legal standing," she said, "but men like Fitch don't always work through legal channels first." "No," Thomas agreed. "They don't." He looked at her. "You don't have to handle this alone." She met his eyes. "I know I don't. I'm not asking for help with it, I am telling you because you should know and because," she paused, "because this next part was harder, because you have become someone I trust." Something moved through his expression, something quiet and significant. "That means something to me," he said. "I know," she said, and then felt heat rise in her face, which she found irritating because she was not 17 years old and she did not blush, except apparently she did, in the October light on this porch with this man looking at her. He smiled then, a real smile, not the brief curve at the corners she had catalogued over months, but a full one, and it changed his face in a way that made her very glad she was already sitting down. Willard Fitch arrived 3 weeks later. He was a heavy-set man in a city coat that was too warm for Texas and too formal for Redemption Creek, and he had a pinched, forward-leaning look about him, the look of a man who was most comfortable when he was pushing. He came to the school on a Wednesday morning during lessons and knocked so hard on the door frame that the younger children startled. Augusta stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Fitch produced a piece of paper covered in figures and began to speak, rapidly, and with the practiced pressure of a man who had done this before, who had learned to talk fast and wave paper and create an impression of official authority before the other person had time to think. He said the money was owed. He said the estate debt passed to surviving family under certain conditions. He said he had traveled a long way and he intended to collect. Augusta waited for him to finish. She had her arms folded, not defensively but precisely, and she waited with such perfect stillness and attentiveness that he eventually ran out of words, and the silence sat there between them. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I have reviewed the relevant Texas statutes regarding estate debt liability. I am not a signatory to any of the debts you have described. I was a minor when the majority of them were incurred, and the Texas Code does not provide for the transfer of estate debt to non-signing adult children in the manner you are describing. I have a letter from a practicing attorney confirming this assessment. I would be happy to provide you with Mr. Morales's address in San Antonio so that you may verify this directly, as I expect you will find his confirmation more satisfying than mine." Fitch's face went through several things. "You think some frontier lawyer's letter is going to stop me from collecting what I'm owed?" "No," she said. "I think the law is going to do that, and the lawyer's letter simply explains why." He stepped toward her, and it was not quite threatening, but it was close, and then the gate in the fence opened and Thomas was there. He had not been anywhere near the school when Augusta looked up, which meant he had either been nearby or someone had gone to get him very quickly, and she was not going to examine how she felt about that just now. He came to stand between Augusta and Fitch, not aggressively, just there, with the straightforward physical presence of a man who was both taller and broader than Fitch and who was not displaying any emotion that Fitch could use. "Is there a problem here?" Thomas asked. "This is between me and the woman," Fitch said. "Miss Hart is the schoolteacher in this town," Thomas said, "which means she is under the general protection of this community, so I will ask again. Is there something you need, or are you planning to continue your morning without causing trouble?" Fitch looked at Thomas, looked at Augusta, looked at the door behind which 23 children were sitting very quietly. He pocketed his papers. "This isn't finished," he said. "I expect it isn't," Thomas said pleasantly, "but I think you'll find it concludes the same way regardless of how many visits you make." Fitch left that afternoon on the stage, and Morales received a letter from his office in San Antonio formally disputing the claim and citing the specific statutes, and Willard Fitch did not come back. The letter from Morales 3 weeks later confirmed that the claim had been withdrawn. Augusta found Thomas in the livery that evening and she said, "Thank you for this morning." He looked up from the horse he was brushing. "I didn't do anything you hadn't already done." "You were there," she said. "That was something." He looked at her for a long moment, and the lamplight in the stable was warm and yellow, and the horse shifted and blew and went still. "Augusta," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice was so particular that she stood very still. He set the brush down on the rail and came toward her, and he stopped a proper distance away and said, "I have been trying to find the right time to say something to you for most of this year." She waited. "I know you came here to build something that belongs to you," he said. "I know you are not looking for someone to tell you what to do or to need things from you that complicate what you are making. I understand that. I respect it." He stopped. He was choosing every word. "But I would like to tell you that I have spent more of this year thinking about you than I have thought about anything else, which is not something that happens to me. And I would like to know if there is any chance you feel something similar, because if there isn't, I will accept that completely, and we will go on being neighbors who trust each other, and that will be enough." Augusta looked at him. She looked at the straightness of him, the particular quiet strength of him, the man who had carried her trunk and listened to his nephew's story and sat across from her writing letters by lamplight and come to stand between her and Fitch without making it about himself. "Thomas," she said, "I have felt something similar since approximately the second week of April." He was quiet for one breath, too. "April," he said, "you kept that to yourself for a long time." "I did," she said. "I was being careful." "That's fair," he said. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and the warmth of it went straight through her the same way it had the very first day, but she had called it something else then. He lifted her hand and held it between both of his, and looked at her with an expression she had not seen him use before, open and unhidden and full of something that she could see now had been waiting to be let out. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is something you want, suppers and walks and whatever the proper protocol is. I don't want to rush you into anything, and I don't want you to feel like your independence is threatened by any of it." She stepped a little closer. "I appreciate that," she said. "I want it." He smiled, the real smile again, and she decided she was going to spend a considerable portion of her future making him do that as often as possible. They courted through the autumn with the care and intention of two people who were not young and careless, but who had both learned to value what was worth keeping. He brought her supper on Thursdays. She brought him books she thought he would enjoy, which he read and reported back on with opinions she had not expected, and which were always worth hearing. They walked the creek road on Sunday afternoons with Caleb running ahead of them through the dry grass, the boy having attached himself to the idea of their courtship with a pragmatic enthusiasm, as though he had surveyed the situation and concluded that Augusta Hart was a sound investment for his household. Caleb flourished through that autumn in a way that was visible and steady. His reading improved rapidly, as did his arithmetic, but more than that he began to lose the tightness he had arrived with, the braced quality of a child who does not know what is coming next and has learned to be ready for the worst. He still had his serious eyes, but now there was something behind the seriousness that had room in it. He wrote 3 more stories, each one better than the last, and Augusta kept copies of all of them with the kind of care usually reserved for important documents. On a Sunday in late November, they were walking the creek road, and Caleb had gone ahead to look at something in the water, and Thomas stopped walking and turned to Augusta. "I have something I want to ask you," he said, "and I want to ask it properly, not in the livery." The cottonwood trees along the creek were bare now, their silver branches against a pale blue sky. The light was thin and cold and beautiful. "I have thought about what your life looked like before you came here," he said. "The farm your father lost, the aunt's house that wasn't safe, the stagecoach ride to a town you had never seen. I know you built everything you have here with your own hands and your own mind, and I would never want to be the thing that diminishes that." He looked at her with his full attention. "I want to be the thing that adds to it. I want to be with you. I want to make a home with you that belongs to both of us. I want Caleb to have you as family in the proper sense, and I want to grow old sitting across a table from you." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Augusta, if you will have me." The creek made its sound, and a hawk crossed the sky, and Caleb's voice called out from down the bank where he had found something interesting in the water. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He took her face in both hands, very carefully, as though she was something he had been hoping for long enough that the reality of it was remarkable to him, and he kissed her, and it was warm and unhurried and entirely right. Caleb came running back from the creek at that moment with a water-stained piece of old timber in his hands, announced that he thought it might be from a Spanish ship, became aware of the situation, looked at the two of them with his serious eyes and said, "Are you getting married?" "Yes," Thomas said. Caleb looked at Augusta. "Good," he said with complete satisfaction and held out the timber. "Do you think this could be from a Spanish ship?" Augusta took the timber and examined it seriously. "It could be," she said. "We should look into it." They were married in December of 1878, in the church whose south wall had been partially repaired by then, though it still let in a draft that kept the ceremony brisk. The whole town came. Maria and Lucia Chavez scattered dried wildflowers in the aisle. Pearl, who had graduated from primers to the Bible in the 3 months since she had started reading, read a passage with such concentrated pride and precision that several people cried. Old Mrs. Rivera brought a cake that was famous in the South Creek community, and she pressed Augusta's hands between hers and said something in Spanish that translated approximately to "May you fill your house with voices." Thomas stood at the altar in his best coat and looked at her when she came down the aisle with such naked happiness and certainty that the draft from the south wall and the mud from the morning's rain and the listing quality of the church's east candle stand all became irrelevant details in the background of that look. They said their vows to each other simply and meant every word. The first year of their marriage had the texture of something built well, which is to say it was not without difficulty, but the difficulty did not threaten the structure. Augusta continued teaching. The town had grown enough that the school board agreed to a small expansion of the schoolroom, and she negotiated the terms with a precision that left Mr. Drummond looking slightly winded and considerably more respectful. Thomas's livery had become the primary stable for the new freight company that had contracted to serve 3 outlying mines, which meant more income and longer hours, but also the kind of established security that let you sleep soundly. They lived in Thomas's house, which they made gradually their house, Augusta's curtains and her books and her kitchen garden, and her way of organizing a room fitting into his space and changing it without erasing it. They were good at the small domestic architecture of 2 people sharing a life, which not everyone is. They argued occasionally, honestly and directly, which meant the arguments resolved and did not build into something unsaid and structural. Caleb was 10 by the spring of 1879 and thriving in the full sense of the word. He had friends now, a group of boys who were usually found either at the creek or in various states of dirt-covered enthusiasm around the livery. He was the best reader in his age group, which he accepted without arrogance as a simple fact, and he had written a story that Augusta had sent to a newspaper in Galveston on a hopeful impulse, and which was printed in the children's section in June of that year. Thomas framed the newspaper page and hung it in the main room, and Caleb pretended to find this embarrassing, but could be found looking at it fairly regularly. Augusta discovered she was expecting a child in the summer of 1879, and she told Thomas in the evening after supper when Caleb was in bed, and he was so still for a moment that she would have been frightened if she had not been able to read his stillness by now. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her, and she felt against her hair the unsteady exhale of a man absorbing something larger than words. "Is this all right?" she asked him. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," he said, with his voice against her hair. "I am completely undone, but in the best possible way." She laughed and he laughed, and Caleb's voice came from behind his door asking what was funny, and they told him. And there was a silence, and then the door opened and Caleb stood there with his hair sticking up in his serious eyes, and he said, "A baby," in a tone that was processing the information actively. "Yes," Augusta said. Caleb looked at Thomas, then back at Augusta. "Will it be as loud as the Watson baby?" "I cannot promise it won't be," Augusta said. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose I can manage it," he said, and went back to bed. Thomas pressed his forehead to Augusta's, and they stood like that in the kitchen lamplight for a long moment. The pregnancy was straightforward. Augusta taught until the week before she was due, which the school board opposed, and she overrode on the grounds that she felt completely well, and the alternative was leaving 31 children with a substitute who was Mr. Drummond's nephew, and who, she had assessed carefully, was not ready for that responsibility. She was civil but absolute about this, and they capitulated. Their son was born in March of 1880, delivered by Mrs. Cordero, who served as the town's midwife, and whose competence Augusta trusted completely. Thomas was outside the cabin door for the duration, which Mrs. Cordero said was the most useful place for men during these matters, and Augusta, in the harder moments, could hear him moving back and forth on the porch in a way that was not quite pacing but was close to it, and she found it comforting in a way she would have been hard-pressed to explain. The baby was born at dawn, with the first light coming through the window, healthy and vocal about it. Mrs. Cordero handed him to Augusta, and he was red-faced and furious and perfect. And when Thomas was allowed in and came to the side of the bed and looked down at the baby, the expression on his face was one Augusta thought she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He reached out and put one finger against the baby's fist, and the baby's fist closed around it with the absolute certainty of someone who has just found what they were looking for. They named him James Hart Monroe, for her father, who for all his failures had loved her in his incomplete and ultimately insufficient way, and because Augusta believed in the power of reclamation, of taking a name that had been associated with loss and giving it back to the world with new meaning. Caleb looked at James with the expression of someone conducting a formal inspection and announced that he was acceptable. He was, after the first week, the most devoted attendant to his infant cousin, spending considerable time crouched beside the cradle reporting to the baby in a low voice about the day's developments, as though keeping James informed was a responsibility he had taken on and intended to honor. The spring of 1880 moved forward with the quality of something that has found its right shape. The town of Redemption Creek had changed in the 2 years since Augusta's arrival. The school enrollment had grown to 44 children. Pearl, now 18, had applied for a teaching position at a newly formed school in the next county, and Augusta had written her a letter of recommendation that was the truth with nothing held back. The South Creek families were still on their land, Morales having thoroughly dismantled the railroad's claims with a legal brief that had apparently become something of a reference document in Texas land law. The church had its south wall repaired completely, and a new schoolroom building had been approved by the board, larger and proper, with real glass windows that Augusta had lobbied for specifically. There was a morning in April of that year when Augusta was at the school, setting up the new room, which still smelled of fresh-cut pine, arranging the benches and the new slates that had arrived from Austin, and she paused at the window and looked out at the main street of Redemption Creek, at the familiar buildings and the familiar sky and the red rock and the scrub and the immense blue overhead. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 2 years ago with a trunk and a job and an absolute absence of anything else, and she thought about everything that had accumulated since. The town that had come to feel like hers, not the way a possession feels but the way a community feels when you are genuinely part of it. The students who had learned to read and reckon and think under her hands, the families of the South Creek who had kept their land, the school that was growing, Pearl, reading the Bible out loud at her wedding, Caleb, looking at the framed newspaper page when he thought no one was watching, James at home in his cradle, alive and growing, and named for the possibility of something better, Thomas. She thought about Thomas, and the thinking of him was so warm and habitual now that it was like thinking of something central, like weather or light, something that had become a condition of her days. She heard the door open and turned, expecting a student, and it was Thomas with James in his arms, the baby awake and looking around at the new room with the alert interest of a child who had recently discovered that looking at things was a worthwhile activity. He wanted to see the new school, Thomas said. "He is 4 months old," Augusta said. "He has opinions," Thomas said seriously. She crossed the room and stood beside Thomas and looked at James, who looked back at her with dark eyes that were going to be his father's eyes. She could already see it, and put his fist in his mouth with concentration. Thomas looked at her looking at the baby, and she looked up and found him looking, and they were standing very close in the new room with its smell of pine and its glass windows with the Texas sky in them, and he shifted James to one arm and put his other arm around her waist, and she leaned into him the way you lean into something that has never once given way. "The windows came out beautifully," he said. "They did," she agreed. The school year ended in June with a program that the whole town attended, at which Caleb read a new story he had written, a longer one this time, about two people who built a town out of a place that had nearly given up on itself. It was fiction, he maintained firmly when people pointed out the resemblances, but he said it with the small private smile he had been developing over the past year, the one that was his father's smile, the one that acknowledged something without making a production of it. Augusta and Thomas sat in the front row with James between them on Thomas's knee, the baby gazing around the assembled town with regal curiosity, and Augusta held Thomas's free hand and listened to Caleb read. And when she looked to her right, the whole of her present life was there, so different from what she had intended it to be and so much larger, so much more particular and complicated and warm and real than anything she could have written in a letter of application. By the summer of 1880 the house had been extended, a proper bedroom for Caleb added off the back, because he was 12 now and the formalities of space were becoming relevant to him, and a nursery off the main room that was, in practice, occupied by James primarily during the day because at night he had developed a firm opinion about where he preferred to sleep, which was between his parents, a situation Augusta had tried to resist and Thomas had failed to resist at all, and which she had eventually accepted as one of those battles not worth winning. Thomas had taken on a partner at the livery, a young man named Felipe from the South Creek community who had a talent for horses that was, if anything, superior to Thomas's own, and who Thomas trained with the patience and thoroughness he applied to everything he considered worth doing correctly. The livery's operation expanded. They took on contracts for the stage line, for the freight company, for a new ranching operation that had moved into the valley to the north, and the income was solid and growing. Augusta began writing in the evenings after James was in his cradle, and Thomas was reading by the fire. She wrote about education on the frontier, about the particular challenges of teaching children from families with multiple languages, about what she had learned in 3 years of practice in Redemption Creek that no teacher's training manual had prepared her for. She was not yet sure what she was writing toward, whether it was letters to the state education office or something more. But the writing felt important, felt like the extension of the same work she did in the classroom, the work of making knowledge available to people who needed it. Thomas read what she wrote, which she had not expected, or rather she had expected the polite interest of a spouse in the spouse's project. What she received instead was a reader who took her arguments seriously, challenged the weak ones with the directness she had come to require of him, and pressed the strong ones further, so that by the time she sent any of it out into the world it was better than it had been. "You should submit this to the Education Journal in Austin," he said one evening, handing back a sheaf of her pages. "It is very presumptuous of a frontier schoolteacher to submit to the Austin Education Journal," she said. "You have been managing a school with 44 students, 2 languages, and a budget that would embarrass a church mouse for 3 years," he said. "Your argument about language instruction is better than anything I have seen in the teacher's publications. Send it." She sent it. It was accepted 3 months later. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, and Augusta read it twice at the breakfast table and set it down and sat very straight in her chair with her hands in her lap, which was what she did when something significant happened that she needed to absorb before responding to. Thomas looked at her, read her face, and said, "Good news." "They accepted it," she said. He was across the table in a moment, and he picked up the letter and read it and looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the kitchen in November of 1878 when she had told him yes, full and open and full of what she now recognized as his particular brand of love, which was not demonstrative in the public sense but was so completely present and reliable that it had the quality of bedrock. "Augusta Hart Monroe," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are remarkable," he said. She stood up and kissed him, and James, from his spot on the floor where he had been investigating a wooden horse that Caleb had carved for him, observed this with the detached scientific interest of a young child watching adults engage in behaviors he has not yet categorized. Autumn of 1880. Redemption Creek had changed again in ways both visible and not. The new schoolhouse stood solid and proper at the edge of the main street, painted white because Augusta had presented the cost estimate to the school board with a particular thoroughness that made refusal difficult. There were now 2 teachers. A woman named Louise from Kentucky had arrived in September to take the younger grades, allowing Augusta to focus on the older students and on the curriculum development work she had been doing alongside her teaching. Louise was 22 and eager and sometimes wrong about things in ways that reminded Augusta of herself at 22, and Augusta mentored her with honesty and without condescension. The South Creek families had not only held their land but had organized a small cooperative for their harvests, which meant better prices at market, and a self-reinforcing system of support that would have made Coles's approach impossible even if he had tried it again. Maria Chavez was 14 now, one of Augusta's best students, with a gift for mathematics that Augusta had been cultivating with a growing sense of obligation, because talent like that needed feeding and the opportunity to become something. Caleb at 12 was becoming a person in the full sense, with opinions and humor and the particular dignity of a child who has been treated with consistent respect long enough that it has become his own. He still wrote. He wrote constantly, covering the backs of slate boards and the margins of discarded newspapers with his stories, and Augusta ordered him a proper notebook from the catalog, which he received with the serious gratitude he gave to things that truly mattered to him. The notebook arrived on a Saturday, and he sat at the kitchen table and opened it to the first page and held his pencil above it for a long moment and then looked up. "I'm going to write something important in this," he said. "I believe you," Augusta said. James, who was by this point 8 months old, was standing at the kitchen chair with one hand gripping the rail and looking around the room with the absolute confidence of someone who has recently discovered vertical orientation and is very pleased with it. He looked at Caleb with his father's serious eyes, and then attempted to take a step and sat down with a thump and regarded the floor with dignified composure. Thomas, who was fixing the front door hinge, heard the thump, looked around the door frame, assessed the situation, and looked at Augusta. "He's all right," she said. "I know," he said. "He has your persistence. He has your stubbornness," she said. "They're different things," he said, and went back to the hinge. "They are not different things," she called after him. She heard him laughing on the other side of the door, the warm, unhurried laugh she had been collecting since November of 1878. The winter of 1880 was mild by the standards of the Texas frontier, which is to say it was cold enough for fires and short enough days that the evenings were long, and the 4 of them, the family of 4 now. She thought of it as a family of 4 without the thought requiring any adjustment, fell into winter rhythms that were close and warm. Thomas read to James while Augusta prepared lessons. Caleb worked on his notebook story at the kitchen table with the concentration of a dedicated craftsman. There were card games and chess, which Caleb had taught himself from a book and then taught Thomas and Augusta, and who was, by Christmas, defeating both of them regularly, a development he bore with becoming modesty. Christmas in Redemption Creek in 1880 was a gathering of the whole community, as it had been the previous year and the year before. The church was full and warm, and the South Creek families came with their food and their music and their presents, and Pearl, who had come back for the holiday from her teaching position in the next county, sat beside Augusta during the carol singing and said, "I have 12 students. with a pride that was quietly incandescent. "I know," Augusta said. "I read your letters." "I made a mistake with the long multiplication last month," Pearl said. "I taught them the wrong carrying method." "What did you do?" "I went back the next day and told them I had made a mistake and taught them the right way." "That is exactly what you do," Augusta said. "That is exactly right." Pearl looked at her with the look she had had at 16, fierce and assessing, but the fierceness now was different, pointed outward instead of inward. "Thank you," she said, "for the letter you wrote me, for teaching me, for not making it a thing." "It was never a thing," Augusta said. "You did the work." The year turned to 1881. James was walking now, a determined and slightly precarious walk that he had committed to with the same absolute investment he brought to everything. And the house acquired the particular quality of a house containing a walking child, which is to say nothing breakable was safe below a certain height, and the word no was in heavy daily usage. He was bright and stubborn and warm, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's set to the mouth, and he already had opinions about everything, and communicated them with the emphatic clarity of someone who had not yet learned that volume is not the same as argument. Augusta was expecting again. She told Thomas in February, and he received it with the same quality of complete overwhelmed happiness he had the first time, which she had worried might be specific to the novelty of a first child, but turned out to be simply Thomas's response to the fact of new life in connection with her. "A brother or sister for James," he said. "That is how it generally works," she said. "And for Caleb," he said. "Yes," she said, "for all of us." He put both arms around her and held her with the care of someone who handles valuable things with appropriate reverence, and she held him back, and they stood in the kitchen in the February morning light, and outside the window the Texas sky was pale and cold and enormous and very beautiful. She taught through the spring with the same intention she had always brought to it, the slight additional fatigue of early pregnancy and inconvenience she acknowledged and managed. The new school year had brought her class up to 31 older students, and she was doing work she had not been able to do in a single-room setting: differentiated instruction, Latin for the students who showed the aptitude and interest, advanced mathematics through algebra for the small group that included Maria Chavez and two others whose gifts deserved a harder ceiling to press against. Maria's father had come to see Augusta in the spring, a formal visit, his hat in his hands in the way of men who carry respect like a physical thing. He said that Maria wanted to become a teacher, and that he was proud of this and supported it, but that the path to proper teacher's certification was long, and he was not sure how to help her find it. Could Augusta advise? Augusta advised for 3 hours, at the kitchen table with coffee and the catalog from the Austin Normal School, and the correspondence from the state education office she had been accumulating for 2 years against exactly this kind of need. She laid out the path clearly and practically: the examinations Maria would need, the correspondence coursework available, the certification timeline, the possible scholarship that Augusta was already composing a letter in her mind to apply for on Maria's behalf. Mr. Chavez listened with the focused attention of a man who understands he is receiving something important. When Augusta finished, he said, "We did not always have help like this." "I know," Augusta said. "I am sorry for that." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "She will be a great teacher," he said. "She will," Augusta said with certainty. The baby came in October of 1881, another boy, born in the morning with the ease of a second birth and the same furious vitality of his brother. They named him William, for Thomas's father, who had died when Thomas was young, and who Thomas spoke of seldom, but with the careful respect of someone carrying a grief that has been lived with long enough to be integrated. Caleb held William with the slightly terrified reverence of a 13-year-old who has been handed something small and entirely capable of screaming. And James, who was 19 months old, and regarded the new baby with the calculating assessment of someone whose position in the household has been complicated, pressed his fist very gently against William's face, and then looked at Augusta with an expression that she read as resolving toward acceptance. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed beside Augusta with William in his arms, and James was climbing over his father's knee with the single-minded determination he brought to all physical objectives, and Caleb was in the doorway having retreated to a position of supportive observation. And Augusta looked at all of them, the whole accumulated specific miracle of the life she had built, the children and the man and the town, outside the window and the school and the sky and all of it. And she felt something she could not have named when she stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek 3.5 years ago, because she had not yet had any context for it. She felt, entirely and without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, that everything she had carried through all the hard years before had been building towards something as particular and specific as this room, this morning, this family. Thomas looked at her, the way he had been looking at her for 3.5 years, and he said quietly, so only she heard it, "All right." She reached out and put her hand against his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips against her palm, and she said, "Better than all right," which was what he had said to her once in a kitchen in the dark, and he smiled, the full one, the real one, and James took the opportunity of his father's distraction to seize William's foot with both hands in a gesture that was either affection or investigation or possibly both. The years settled into themselves, as years do when the life they contain is the right size for the people living it. The school continued to grow. Augusta's article in the Austin Education Journal was followed by 2 more, and she received a letter from the state superintendent of education asking if she would be willing to consult on curriculum development for frontier schools across the region, which she agreed to with conditions that included maintaining her own classroom and not being asked to move to Austin, both of which were accepted. Maria Chavez received her teacher's certification in 1883. She came to tell Augusta herself, arriving at the house on a Sunday morning with the letter in her hand and her dark eyes bright. Augusta embraced her, which was not something she did with former students in the ordinary way, and said that this was the best news she had heard since William was born healthy, which was not entirely true, but was the right thing to say and also not entirely false. Caleb turned 15 in 1883 and was writing things that Augusta, who had read broadly and thought carefully about writing, knew were genuinely good. He showed her everything he wrote, and she responded with the same honest, engaged attention she would have given to anyone she respected, not the encouraging softness of an adult reading a child's work, but the real thing. This is strong. This is where it loses me. This is the sentence I would quote if I were recommending it to someone. He submitted a story to a literary magazine in St. Louis and was rejected, and he received this with the equanimity of someone who had been taught that rejection was information and not verdict. He revised the story according to what he could learn from the rejection and the comments Augusta helped him read constructively, and submitted it again, and was accepted. Thomas read the letter of acceptance with the expression Augusta knew well, the one that filled up from the inside, and said to Caleb, "Your mother would have been proud," simply and directly, in the way he spoke about Ruth occasionally, keeping her present in the boy's life without making the presence a burden. Caleb received this with the particular composure of a boy who has carried his grief for long enough to be able to sit with it comfortably. "I know," he said. Then, after a moment, "I think about showing her things when something good happens." "That doesn't stop," Thomas said. "It just becomes a way of including them." James, who was 4.5 by this point and interested in everything, had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention he gave to adult conversations, accumulating information, and said, with the absolute seriousness of a 4-year-old making a metaphysical inquiry, "Where is she?" "She is wherever the people we love go," Augusta said. James considered this. "That is far," he said. "Yes," Thomas said, "but not so far that they can't hear you if you talk to them." James appeared to accept this, then went back to the wooden horse he had been working on, which was an attempt to saddle the carved horse with a piece of leather string. William, 2 years old and solid as a small rock, watched his brother from the floor with the patient and slightly imperious gaze he had already developed into a signature expression. The house was full and warm and loud, in the particular way of a house that is working properly. Spring of 1884. Redemption Creek had arrived, by the consensus of its residents and at least one article in the Galveston paper, at something that could be reasonably called a proper town. There were 430 residents within the town limits, and perhaps as many again in the surrounding valley and homesteads. There was a proper general store and a doctor and a post office with its own full-time postmaster. The church had been fully repaired and expanded. The school had a second building. Augusta walked to school on a morning in April, the kind of morning when the air is clear and cool, and the smell of the earth is rich, and the light is that particular gold that comes early in spring, and the walk from the house to the school took her past the livery, where Felipe was opening the big doors for the morning, past the general store where old Mr. Hartley was arranging his display with the conscientious attention he brought to it every morning, past the group of children already gathered on the school ground, some of them hers and some of them Louise's, the noise of them a bright, undifferentiated sound. She stood at the door of the school and looked at the town, the place that had been a cluster of leaning boards when she arrived and was now a thing built and tended and inhabited, and she felt the particular quality of belonging that comes from having put your labor into a place and had it put something back. Thomas found her there. He had seen her stop from the livery door, had come to stand beside her, and she heard his footstep and leaned into his shoulder without looking, because she always knew his footstep. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood side by side looking at the town, the two of them in the morning light, the school behind her and the livery ahead of him and the life they had made between them, the boys at home with Caleb, who was 16 and reliable in the way of someone who has taken responsibility seriously for long enough that it has become simply part of who he is. "I was thinking," Thomas said, "that we should take the boys to the river this Sunday." "James has been asking about fishing." "James has been asking about fishing for 3 weeks, Augusta said. "Then we are overdue," he said. She laughed, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she turned her head and looked at him in the morning light, this man who had carried her trunk, and listened to stories and written letters by lamplight and stood between her and what threatened her, and held her through grief and celebrated everything she had built and made 2 sons with her, and called her remarkable with the simplicity of someone stating a plain fact. "Sunday, then," she said. "Sunday," he said. He kissed her in the street in front of the school, which was not improper exactly but was observed, because everything in Redemption Creek was observed, and she did not mind in the least, and he walked back to the livery, and she went inside to teach. That Sunday they went to the river, all 5 of them, Thomas and Augusta and Caleb and James with his very first fishing pole, which Thomas had made him from a stick and a length of line and a hook bent by hand, and William, who was 3 and not interested in fishing but very interested in the mud along the bank. They spent the afternoon there in the warmth of May, the sound of the river and the children and the birds, the wide Texas sky above the cottonwoods, and James caught a small fish and held it up with the expression of someone who has achieved something fundamental, and Thomas showed him how to hold it and release it back, and the fish disappeared into the brown water, and James watched the place where it had gone for a long moment and then turned to Augusta with his dark eyes. "It went home," he said. "It did," she said. "Good," he said with satisfaction, and went to find a better spot to fish. Augusta watched her sons and her husband and the river and the sky, and she felt the fullness of it, the complete, unreserved fullness of a life that had been built honestly and tended with love, a life that was hers and also belonged to all of them, irreducibly theirs together. She had come to Texas with a trunk and a letter of appointment, and the practical determination of a woman who had learned that the world does not give you what you need if you wait for it to notice. She had found, in the most unexpected way, that what she built with her own hands had made space for something she had not planned and could not have imagined from the platform of ascent. Louis Stagecoach, this family, this town, this man, these children. She thought of the schoolroom and the students still to come, of Maria Chavez teaching now in her own classroom, of Pearl in the next county with 12 students and growing. She thought of the articles she was writing and the work still ahead, and the boys growing and all the years of mornings still to walk to school and come home to this house. Thomas came and sat beside her on the bank, and the afternoon light moved through the cottonwood leaves above them, and William fell down in the mud and sat there with great dignity, and James was very still with his line in the water, and Caleb was upstream reading with his back against a tree. "Happy?" Thomas asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder and looked at the river. "Completely," she said. And she was.